A billionaire laughed at a boy who claimed to speak 9 languages. He didn't know that laugh would cost him everything. Subscribe and follow this story to the end. The sound of laughter filled the glass-walled penthouse office high above Manhattan, a deep, rolling laugh that belonged not to joy but to mockery. It came from Omar Rahman, a 48-year-old oil magnate whose empire spanned continents and whose arrogance filled every inch of the room. His voice echoed like the roar of a predator amused by its prey. Across from him, clutching a worn public school backpack, stood a 14-year-old boy named Michael Carter. His dark skin caught the glow of the chandelier, but his steady gaze betrayed no fear, only quiet resistance. Next to him, his mother, Linda Carter, stood trembling, a cleaning bucket balanced in her hands as though it were her last shield. She had made the mistake of bringing her son to work, and now humiliation loomed over both of them. "You speak 9 languages?" Omar said, his laughter rising again. 9? Kid, you can barely speak English." Michael's cheeks burned, yet he held his ground. He had already learned the cruel laws of this world. People like him and his mother were judged before they ever opened their mouths. A black teenager from the Bronx, son of a cleaning lady. Labels stacked like chains around his neck. Still, his voice did not falter. "Yes, sir, 9 languages." The words came calmly, but Omar's smirk widened as he leaned back in his $15,000 leather chair. He loved these moments, when power was so absolute that he could toy with others like a cat with a trapped mouse. Linda whispered urgently, her voice carrying years of submission. "Michael, apologize to Mr. Rahman," but Omar waved his jeweled hand dismissively. "No, no apology. I want to hear this fantasy. Tell me, boy. What are these 9 languages you supposedly speak?" Michael drew in a breath that seemed far too heavy for his thin shoulders. "English, Spanish, French, German, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Italian, and Portuguese." For a moment, Omar stopped laughing. The way the boy pronounced each name with sharp clarity sounded nothing like pretense. But then he chuckled again and shook his head. "Liar. Your mother should take you to a psychiatrist. Grace, your son has lost touch with reality." Linda lowered her eyes, humiliated. 5 years she had endured comments like these while scrubbing floors and polishing marble. 5 years of swallowing her pride just to keep food on the table for her children. But this was different. Hearing her son mocked cut deeper than anything she had ever endured herself. "Mom," Michael said softly, placing his hand on hers, steadying her trembling. "It's okay." The quiet dignity in his voice unsettled Omar more than the claim itself. He frowned, trying to dismiss the strange tension rising in the air. "So you think you can impress me with big talk? Let's test it. Do you even understand Arabic, boy? It's my native tongue." Michael looked at him evenly. "Then you will understand if I say, Darajatul ilm fawqa darajatil mal al-haqiqa." The silence that followed stretched like a taut string ready to snap. Omar's smirk froze. The words Michael had spoken were in flawless classical Arabic, not the broken phrases a tourist might memorize, but precise structures, rich with nuance and rhythm. For the first time in years, Omar Rahman found himself caught off guard. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his voice lower now, stripped of certainty. "At the public library, sir," Michael answered. "They have free language programs every afternoon." For an instant, Omar felt something almost alien in his chest, respect or perhaps fear, but he quickly shook it away. "Anyone can memorize a phrase," he snapped. "That doesn't mean you speak the language." "You're right," Michael said, nodding with quiet composure. "That's why I brought this." From his backpack he pulled a folder with worn edges and placed it gently on Omar's desk of polished Italian marble. Inside were certificates of proficiency issued by Columbia University and other recognized institutions. Grades marked fluent across all 9 languages. Omar scoffed, but his eyes flickered as he skimmed the papers. These must be fake. Yet the signatures and official seals were undeniable, printed boldly in ink that made his chest tighten. "And this," Michael continued, producing another document, is from the Advanced Linguistics program at the Municipal Library. And this one from an online simultaneous translation course I completed last month. The room seemed smaller as Omar leafed through the documents, each page eroding his certainty. He tried to steady his hand but felt it trembling. This child, the son of his cleaning lady, had accomplished what professional diplomats spent years mastering. His world tilted, and for once, mockery could not anchor him. Linda stared at her son, hardly able to breathe. She had known he was gifted, yes, but not the depth of it, not the magnitude. And now, watching him stand unflinching before one of the richest men in America, she felt both pride and fear twist inside her. Omar placed the papers down and pushed them away as though they carried poison. "Anyone can take online courses. That doesn't prove anything," he muttered, more to himself than to Michael. His voice carried none of the thunder it had minutes before. Michael only smiled faintly. He was no longer the boy being ridiculed. The room had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. "That's why I brought something else," he said. His hand reached again into his backpack, pulling out a tablet. As the screen lit up and the image of an academic office appeared, Omar's frown deepened. An Asian woman appeared on the video call. Michael spoke, his voice flowing into perfect Mandarin, addressing her with deference. "Professor Chen, could you confirm to Mr. Rahman my performance in your business translation course?" The professor answered in rapid Mandarin, her tone animated and warm. Omar didn't understand the words, but he could feel the complexity, the effortless rhythm of their exchange. Then she switched to English. "Mr. Rahman, this boy is the most talented student I've had in 15 years. His fluency is extraordinary, like a native of Beijing." Omar ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling slightly as he set the tablet down. He looked at Linda, his voice unsteady. "Did you know this?" Linda shook her head slowly. "Michael has always been smart, sir, but I didn't know this." Michael spoke again, quietly but firmly. "I started when I was 11. My mom worked 2 jobs to pay for my private school, but she lost one during the pandemic. Public school became too easy, so I chose to spend my time learning something useful." The words landed heavier than stone. Omar's own children, nurtured by the most expensive tutors money could buy, had never achieved anything like this. And here stood a boy who had used free library programs to outpace them all. For the first time in years, Omar Rahman did not feel superior in his own office. He felt cornered, uncertain. Michael lifted his chin. "Languages open doors, sir. When you speak to someone in their own language, they stop seeing you as a stranger and start seeing you as a human being." The observation struck Omar like a blow. For decades he had used cultural differences to justify his detachment from his American employees. It wasn't culture, it was arrogance. He stared at the boy across from him, and something inside whispered a question he could not yet voice. The predator's laughter was gone. In its place lingered unease, and perhaps the beginning of change. And yet, Omar Rahman did not know that this was only the beginning, that Michael Carter had come prepared with far more than certificates and phrases. He had come armed with truths that could unravel empires. The air in the penthouse was heavy, waiting, ready for the next move. The air in the penthouse was so still that even the hum of the city outside felt muted. Omar Rahman leaned back in his leather chair, the same smirk on his lips, though it wavered now, less steady than before. He stared at the papers Michael had laid out, papers he desperately wanted to dismiss as fraud. Yet the stamps gleamed official, and the signatures carried names he recognized. "Anyone can forge documents," Omar said flatly, drumming his fingers against the desk. "Do you think I haven't seen fakes before?" Linda Carter shifted uneasily beside her son, clutching the bucket against her chest as if it might protect her. Her eyes flicked nervously from the billionaire to her boy. She whispered, almost pleading, "Michael, please, let's just go." But Michael did not move. He looked straight at Omar. "You don't have to take my word for it. Call your assistant. Verify one of them. The phone number is right there." Omar narrowed his eyes. The boy was challenging him openly and worse, doing it without fear. He picked up one certificate at random, sliding his thumb over the embossed seal. Then, with a sharp gesture, he pressed a button on his desk phone. "Rashid," he said curtly when a voice answered, "check this serial number with Columbia University, now." Minutes dragged like hours. Omar tapped the desk impatiently, his gaze fixed on Michael as though waiting for the boy to flinch. But Michael stood silently, his shoulders squared. Linda kept her head lowered, wishing she could shield her son from this circus, yet secretly marveling at his calmness. The intercom crackled back to life. "Sir," Rashid's voice hesitated, "it's genuine." Issued 3 months ago. Omar's hand froze mid-drum. For the briefest moment his composure cracked. He cleared his throat, leaning forward again, forcing his voice into steel. "One certificate means nothing. You could have found a way to cheat." Michael spoke evenly, not raising his voice. "You wanted proof, you got it. But if you still doubt me, then test me, right here, right now." The suggestion cut through the air like a blade. Linda inhaled sharply. "Michael," he raised a hand gently toward her without looking. "It's okay, Mom." Omar pushed back from his chair and rose to his full height, towering over the boy. He gestured toward a shelf stacked with books, lavish displays of world literature, many untouched. "Fine," he said. "Translate something. If you're as good as you claim, prove it." Michael walked calmly to the shelf, pulled down a volume of Russian poetry, and opened to a random page. His voice slipped into flawless Russian, the syllables flowing with natural rhythm, not hesitating once. Then he translated into English, line by line, preserving the cadence. Linda stared in awe, her lips parting. She had never heard her son sound like this, never imagined the fluency rolling so effortlessly off his tongue. Omar clenched his jaw. "Anyone can memorize poems," he snapped. Without being asked, Michael set the book down, picked up another, this time a French economic analysis, and began reading aloud. He translated each phrase into English with clinical precision, switching tone depending on the author's argument. Then in Spanish he added commentary as though he were a professor, explaining it to students. Omar's lips parted, but no sound came out. He had demanded a test, and the boy had passed it not once, but twice. Still, pride clung stubbornly to him. "So you can parrot words," he muttered. "That doesn't make you special." Michael looked at him then, calm but sharp. "Do you really believe repeating words is all I can do?" The boy reached into his backpack again. He produced another sheet, this one a letter from the municipal library's head linguistics instructor. Omar scanned it, his brow furrowing as he recognized the official seal of the city itself. The letter praised Michael as a prodigy, someone whose comprehension went far beyond memorization, someone who had mastered not just grammar, but cultural nuance. Linda shifted again, unable to contain herself. She looked at Omar with a voice that trembled, but carried something close to defiance. "Sir, I've scrubbed this office floor for 5 years. I've heard you and your partners mocking people like me, but my son, he worked harder with nothing than most do with everything." The silence after her words was heavier than before. Omar glanced at her for the first time, as though realizing she was not simply a servant in the background, yet his instinct was still to resist. He gripped the edge of his desk, steadying himself. "You think this changes anything? Knowledge without power is nothing. The world won't bow to a boy from the Bronx." Michael did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, placing the document squarely in front of Omar. "Maybe not," he said finally, "but it made you stop laughing." The words struck harder than any certificate. For the first time, Omar felt the control of the room slip completely from his hands. His empire, his billions, his carefully cultivated intimidation, all of it felt suddenly brittle in the presence of a boy who refused to shrink. Linda placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Her eyes glistened, pride breaking through the years of submission. "Michael," she whispered, "you don't have to fight him." But Michael's gaze never left Omar. "I'm not fighting, Mum. I'm proving." The tension was unbearable, the silence thick with what had just shifted. Omar turned away, walking slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stared at the skyline, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, hollow and unsettled. His voice, when it came, was quieter. "Why? Why push this? What do you want?" Michael answered simply. "Respect. For my mother. For people like us. For the truth." The billionaire's jaw tightened. He did not turn around. The boy's words lingered in the air, dragging behind them the weight of years Omar had spent convincing himself that wealth made him superior. Now, confronted by a teenager with nothing but determination and borrowed books, the certainty wavered. And still, the silence remained, heavy and unbroken, until the distant ring of Omar's phone cut through. He ignored it. He was thinking of something else, something he hadn't thought of in decades. His own arrival in America as a teenager, struggling with English, mocked for his accent. He pushed the thought away. He could not afford to feel empathy now. Michael's voice cut back through the air, steady as before. "You think money is power, but words can build or destroy empires. You should know that better than anyone." The line pierced Omar deeply, though he masked it by adjusting his cufflinks. He wanted to reassert control, to strike the boy down with a phrase that would restore the hierarchy, but nothing came. His tongue felt heavy. His office, usually a throne room, now felt like a cage. Linda's whisper filled the space. "Sir, please don't punish us for this. We need this job, we always have." But Omar said nothing. His silence was his only defense, and in that silence the balance shifted further. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by the weight of unspoken truths. Michael Carter stood firm, a boy refusing to bend, while his mother's trembling began to subside, replaced by a flicker of hope. The silence stretched, and inside it, Omar realized something he could not admit aloud. He was no longer in command of the moment. The boy was. And though Omar would not yet say it, the questions now pressing at the edges of his mind, questions about libraries, about hidden strength, about the cost of arrogance, were the very questions that would carry into the next chapter of their confrontation. The penthouse office still hummed with silence, but Michael Carter's calm stare seemed to demand more than the billionaire was willing to give. Omar Rahman turned from the window, his expression carefully arranged into neutrality, though his eyes betrayed unease. He wanted to push back harder, to crush this defiance. Instead, he said stiffly, "So you studied languages in a library. Do you expect me to believe that?" Michael's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, sir, because that's exactly how it happened." The boy's voice carried the weight of memory, and as he spoke, the story unfolded like a shadow across the gleaming penthouse. 3 years earlier, the Bronx Library had been more than a building of books to him. It was sanctuary. Michael had discovered it on a rain-soaked afternoon after school, ducking inside only to escape the storm. The warmth of the shelves, the quiet of the reading rooms, and the computer terminals glowing with promise drew him in. While other kids wandered the streets or played games, Michael sat hunched over dictionaries, free software, and borrowed textbooks. He remembered how his mother, exhausted after double shifts, would ask softly, "You're really going back to the library again?" And he would nod. He didn't always explain what he was doing. Sometimes she assumed he just wanted a quiet place away from the chaos of their neighborhood. But to Michael, the library had been more than quiet. It was possibility. At first, the challenge had been English itself, its vast vocabulary, its contradictions. Then Spanish, thanks to the diverse families around him. French followed, sparked by a dusty grammar book he found on a bottom shelf. The more languages he learned, the more the world expanded. Each page felt like a door swinging open, each phrase a bridge to another universe. And in the dim light of that library, under the steady hum of old fluorescent bulbs, a boy began to build a fortress no one could see. Omar's voice dragged him back to the present. "You expect me to believe you did all that alone, without tutors, without privilege?" His words were sharp, but his tone lacked the certainty it once carried. Michael answered quietly, almost conversationally. "Yes, alone, But I wasn't really alone. The librarians helped me find materials. They didn't care that I was a kid from the Bronx. They just cared that I wanted to learn. Linda Carter closed her eyes at the memory. She had watched him leave with his backpack each afternoon, never guessing the scale of his ambition. Now the truth unfolded, and pride welled in her chest despite the danger they faced. Michael reached once more into his backpack. This time he pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen. The face of a woman appeared, a middle-aged professor sitting at her desk surrounded by papers. He greeted her in flawless Mandarin, his tone warm, respectful, and fluid. "Professor Chen, could you confirm to Mr. Rahman how I performed in your business translation course?" The professor smiled. "In Mandarin," she replied rapidly, praising his mastery, her words flowing with a speed and complexity that even Omar, who could not understand, recognized as genuine. Michael answered with equal fluency, nodding politely as though this were routine. Then she switched to English. "Mr. Rahman, this young man is the most extraordinary student I've had in 15 years of teaching. His comprehension is not just fluent, it is native. He understands idioms, formal registers, even subtle regional tones. It is as though he was born in Beijing." Omar's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. He cut the call abruptly, setting the tablet down with more force than necessary. His voice came low as though speaking through clenched teeth. "So you had help. A professor gave you an edge." Michael did not flinch. "She offered guidance after I showed up to every free session the library streamed. I did the rest." Linda's voice trembled. She looked at Omar directly for the first time. "Sir, my son doesn't lie. He spent hours at that library every single day. I used to beg him to come home, but he wouldn't. He said he was building something." Michael turned to her, his voice soft but firm. "I was building a way out, Mom. Not just for me, for us." Omar's face betrayed a flicker of something almost human, but he masked it quickly. "Words don't feed families, ambition doesn't put food on the table." Michael's response came steady, unshaken. "No, sir. But ignorance costs millions. You of all people should know that." The billionaire froze at the words. His memory flashed to the recent call with Middle Eastern investors, the uneasy silence on the other end of the line. He had blamed the connection, but doubt crept in now, sharp and biting. Could it be true that a 14-year-old boy had understood mistakes he hadn't even realized? Michael saw the hesitation. "You used the wrong term for urgency," he said calmly. "And you confused two critical words for deadlines. Small differences, but enough to change the meaning completely." They were confused. They almost walked away, weren't they? Omar's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he tried to suppress. "Because I've been studying business Arabic for 2 years," Michael answered evenly. "It's my specialty. I could hear everything you missed." Linda gasped softly, covering her mouth. The thought that her son had not only mastered languages, but had quietly been saving contracts worth millions, stunned her. Omar, for once, did not know what to say. His empire had been built on dominance, yet now it trembled because of the oversight of a single word and because a boy had caught it. The silence stretched once more, but this silence was not empty. It was filled with Omar's unraveling certainty, Linda's dawning pride, and Michael's steady determination. He spoke again, his voice calm but cutting. "Knowledge isn't a luxury, Mr. Rahman. It's survival. You forgot that." But I didn't. And though Omar's face hardened, his silence confirmed the truth. The empire he thought unshakable had cracks, and a boy from the Bronx had found them. The weight of the library, of years spent under its fluorescent lights, pressed invisibly into the penthouse. Michael's story had been told, but the battle had only just begun. He had shown his strength, revealed his preparation. Yet in the depths of his backpack lay a secret that would make everything he had said pale in comparison. That secret waited, patient and ready, as the confrontation edged toward its inevitable breaking point. The city lights blinked far below, but inside the penthouse the only light that mattered was the hard glow of tension between the boy and the billionaire. Omar Rahman sat back down behind his marble desk, fingers pressed against his temples. For years he had been the man who controlled every room he entered. Yet now, with a 14-year-old standing before him, the control slipped like sand through his hands. He tried to steady his tone, though the cracks were audible. "So you memorized languages. You found professors willing to give you free lessons. It's impressive, I'll admit that, but it doesn't make you valuable to me." Michael Carter stood tall, voice measured. "Then maybe this will." From his backpack he pulled a slim folder and placed it gently on the desk. Omar raised a skeptical brow before flipping it open. Inside were printed reports, press releases, transcripts of investor calls, and public documents tied to Rahman Industries. Each page was marked with underlined notes, corrections, and margin explanations written in precise handwriting. Michael's voice narrated the evidence with calm precision. "I studied your company's public communications. I noticed recurring mistakes, translation errors, misuse of terms, cultural missteps. At first I thought they were isolated, but they weren't. They form a pattern." Linda, standing beside her son, looked from the papers to Omar, her breath caught in her throat. She could not believe Michael had gone so far. Omar snorted, though his eyes flicked over the annotations with growing unease. "What does a boy know about business?" Michael answered without hesitation. "Enough to know you lost millions because of a single mistranslation. In last year's press release to your South American partners, you used the word costo instead of costo de inversión. What you wrote sounded like you were complaining about losses instead of discussing investment structure. They pulled out of negotiations 2 weeks later." Omar froze mid-page. He remembered that failure vividly. The deal had collapsed without explanation. His advisors had blamed shifting politics. Never once had he considered that a linguistic nuance had doomed the talks. Michael continued, each word deliberate. "In your European division, your team released a statement in French describing your executives as arrogant instead of assertive. The nuance destroyed your credibility with a key market. And in your Mandarin documents, you used a phrase that translated as desperate for approval. That one cost you another contract." Omar's jaw tightened. He tried to dismiss it, but the truth hit too close. He had built his empire on strength, on the illusion that he was untouchable. Yet here was a boy tearing through that illusion with nothing more than words. "You're bluffing," Omar said flatly, though his voice lacked conviction. Michael shook his head. "You can check. Everything I wrote is sourced. Public records, archived press, nothing hidden, just overlooked. By your executives. By you." The billionaire slammed the folder shut and pushed it away as if distance could erase its contents. "Even if what you say is true, it doesn't matter. No one will listen to a janitor's son making accusations." Linda flinched at the word, her knuckles whitening around the bucket she still held. But Michael did not flinch. He looked directly at Omar, his tone sharper now. "You're wrong. People always listen when money is at stake, and your mistakes have cost hundreds of millions." The words struck harder than any insult. For the first time, Omar's pride cracked audibly in the silence. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but edged with fire. "You mocked me because you thought intelligence belonged to you and people like you. But intelligence isn't inherited, it's built. You built your empire with money. I built mine with books," Linda whispered, unable to hold back the rising emotion. "Michael, please." But he shook his head gently. "Mum, he needs to hear this." Omar tried to rise again, as though his height could restore the dominance slipping away. But when he spoke, his words betrayed his fear. "Do you expect me to believe you studied my company for fun? That you dissected contracts and press releases just to prove a point?" Michael replied calmly. "Yes, because I wanted to understand the world, and because I knew one day I would have to prove that someone like me could do more than scrub floors." For a moment, Omar was silent, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The boy's certainty unnerved him. His empire had been shaken, not by competitors or scandals, but by a teenager who refused to remain invisible. Michael opened the folder again, sliding a final page across the desk. "This is a proposal, a restructuring of your international communications strategy. If you implement it, you could recover hundreds of millions in lost contracts." Omar stared at the page. It was detailed, precise, professional, better than reports his executives produced after weeks of work. And it was written by a child who still carried notebooks in a second-hand backpack. Linda looked at her son, with eyes shimmering with pride and fear all at once. She knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, challenging a man who had the power to crush them. But she also knew there was no turning back now. Omar's voice, when it finally came, was stripped of arrogance. It was raw, almost whispering. How could you know all this?" Michael answered softly, but every word cut deep. "Because you underestimated me. You always underestimate people like us." The room was heavy, filled with the collapse of a man's pride and the rise of something he had never seen coming. Omar Rahman, once untouchable, sat in his own office staring at proof of his failures. And Michael Carter, a boy from the Bronx, stood calm and unyielding, his mother's hand trembling on his arm, as if she alone understood the storm they had just unleashed. But Michael knew this was only the beginning. Because the folder of notes, as devastating as it was not his sharpest weapon. The real strike still waited in his backpack, silent and patient, ready to expose something darker than business mistakes. That moment was coming, and when it did, the empire Omar had built on arrogance would face its greatest test. The folder of annotated contracts still lay on the marble desk, its pages a silent accusation. Omar Rahman's hand hovered over it, then pulled back as if afraid to touch proof of his own failings. He cleared his throat and forced a brittle laugh. "So you're clever. You can point out mistakes. But cleverness doesn't make you powerful. You're still just a boy." Michael Carter did not move, his calm gaze steady. "Sometimes being a boy helps. People don't notice you. They say things they shouldn't." Omar's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Michael's hand slipped into his backpack once more. From its depths he pulled out a small black digital recorder. He placed it on the desk with quiet finality. Linda Carter stiffened, her heart lurching. She whispered sharply, "Michael, what is that?" Michael looked at her, his tone soft. "The truth." Omar's face went pale. His voice turned sharp, almost defensive. "Where did you get that? What's on it?" Michael pressed the play button. A voice filled the office, the unmistakable voice of Omar Rahman himself captured days earlier. It carried arrogance, cruelty, and prejudice. "These black Americans are all the same," the recorded voice declared flatly. "Lazy, uneducated, always blaming others for their failures. That's why I only hire Arabs and whites for important positions." Linda gasped, a trembling hand covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the man she had worked for, scrubbed floors for, endured insults from. Omar's real self, raw and hateful, now echoed through the room. Omar lunged forward and slammed the stop button. His voice cracked with fury. "Where did you record this?" Michael answered with calm precision. "In the elevator. Last week. You thought you were alone with your vice president, but I was there. And in New York only one person has to consent to a recording." "It's perfectly legal." Omar's lips parted, but no sound came. His mind raced. That single recording was enough to destroy him. Lawsuits, government investigations, the end of his empire. He could already imagine headlines plastered across the city, his name dragged through mud. "This is blackmail," he said finally, his voice shaking. Michael's reply was even, unyielding. "No, this is justice. You built your empire on arrogance and prejudice. You laughed at me because you thought we were nothing. Now you will choose. Either prove you can change or I make sure this recording is heard everywhere." Linda turned to her son, her voice filled with both fear and awe. "Michael, what are you doing?" He looked at her with steady eyes. "Protecting us. Protecting everyone like us." Omar gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He tried to summon the same dominance he had always carried, but his voice came out brittle. "What do you want?" Michael did not hesitate. He placed a typed contract on the desk, sliding it across the marble. His voice was calm, deliberate. First, I want my mother promoted to facilities supervisor with a salary of $80,000 a year. Second, I want a scholarship program created for young people from disadvantaged communities funded by your company. And third, I want a position as junior language consultant. Omar blinked at him, stunned. You're 14 years old. Michael replied firmly, and I speak 9 languages better than any adult you employ. I've already saved you millions by pointing out your mistakes. I can save you more. Linda's knees weakened, her body trembling. She whispered, Michael, this is too much. But he turned to her and said softly, Mum, this is exactly enough. Omar stared at the typed contract. His instincts screamed to reject it, to throw the boy and his mother out and call security. But the recorder sat there, silent yet deadly, holding his empire hostage. He tried to buy time. How do I know you won't release the recording even if I sign? Michael's answer came swiftly. Because unlike you, I believe in giving people second chances. If you sign, you get that chance. If you don't, then the world will know who you really are. Linda's eyes shimmered with tears. She whispered to Omar, her voice no longer submissive, but edged with quiet strength. 5 years I've worked here. 5 years you never even looked at me as human. Now my son stands here showing you what real worth looks like. Don't waste this chance. Omar picked up the contract. His hands trembled as he scanned its contents. It was thorough, detailed, legally sound. The boy had thought of everything: protections against retaliation, clauses binding the company to real commitments. Michael Carter had not just come prepared, he had come armed for victory. Omar muttered under his breath, This is madness. Michael's voice rose calm but unrelenting. No, this is fairness. You've spent years profiting from an unjust system. Now you have the chance to be part of the solution. The billionaire looked down at the gold pen on his desk. The weight of it had always symbolized power. Now it felt heavy for another reason, because signing meant surrendering to the truth he had denied for years. Finally, Omar Rahman lowered the pen to the paper. His signature flowed across the page, sealing not only a contract but the collapse of his pride. He looked up at Michael, his voice breaking. You're frighteningly smart, boy. Michael replied quietly, No. Just prepared. The silence that followed was thick with transformation. Linda Carter stood taller than she ever had in that office, dignity replacing the years of bowed submission. Omar leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of defeat, but also, strangely, the first hint of relief. Yet Michael wasn't finished. From his backpack he pulled out 2 more recorders and placed them on the desk. Omar's eyes widened. Michael said evenly, For your information, everything that happened here today was also recorded, including you signing this contract of your own free will. For the first time, Omar laughed, but it was not the cruel laugh that had filled the room hours earlier. It was a laugh tinged with disbelief and maybe, hidden deep beneath, admiration. You planned everything, he said slowly. Michael nodded once. Always have a plan, always have proof. And though the confrontation had ended with Omar's signature, the true storm was only beginning. Because the recorder had not only captured his prejudice, it had captured the exact moment a billionaire realized a boy from the Bronx had outmaneuvered him completely. That realization would ripple far beyond the walls of the penthouse. The gold pen slipped from Omar Rahman's hand and landed with a dull clink against the marble desk. He had signed. For the first time in his career, a decision had not been born from dominance, calculation, or greed. It had been forced out of him by a boy who stood unwavering in the face of his empire. Omar leaned back in his chair, staring at the signed contract as though it were a verdict. His voice came quietly, stripped of its usual thunder. Do you have any idea what you've just done to me? Michael Carter answered evenly, his tone calm but carrying weight beyond his years. I gave you a choice. You decided, and now you have a chance to change. Linda Carter, still trembling, reached for her son's arm. Her whisper broke the silence. "Michael, maybe this was too much. Maybe we should leave before something worse happens." But Michael shook his head gently. "No, Mom. We can't stop halfway." Omar picked up the recorder Michael had left on the desk. He turned it over in his hand, staring at it like a ticking bomb. His voice came hoarse. "You blackmailed me." Michael's reply was immediate. "I offered you a path to redemption. You called it blackmail. I call it balance." For a long moment, Omar said nothing. He gazed out the tall windows, the skyline glittering in the night. All his life, he had equated power with wealth, but the boy had shattered that illusion. His empire, worth billions, had bent to a teenager armed only with knowledge and preparation. Finally, Omar spoke, his voice low. "You'll want proof of what happens next. You'll want to see that I actually keep these promises." Michael nodded. "Yes, and you'll want proof that I don't betray mine. That's why everything is recorded. Fairness cuts both ways." Omar let out a long, weary sigh. He turned his gaze to Linda. For years he had barely acknowledged her existence, reducing her to the background of his empire. Now he looked at her with something new in his eyes. "You raised him," he said softly. Linda's voice steadied, strong for the first time. "I didn't raise a genius. I raised a man who knows his worth." The words struck Omar deeply. He turned away, unable to face the dignity radiating from the woman he had once dismissed as invisible. Michael gathered the documents back into his backpack. His movements were deliberate, calm as though the storm had already passed, but his voice carried quiet steel when he spoke. "This is only the beginning, Mr. Rahman. You can't undo what you've said. You can only decide what you'll do now." Omar's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. His pride resisted, fighting against the urge to admit what the boy was forcing him to see. Yet some part of him knew this was not the end of his empire. It was the beginning of a reckoning. He looked back at Michael, his words slow, uncertain. "If I keep my word, if I honor this contract, will you keep yours? Will you bury that recording?" Michael's gaze was steady. "If you show that you've learned, yes. But if you betray this, if you treat people the same way you always have, then the world will hear what you really think." The billionaire's lips pressed into a thin line. For once, his fate was in the hands of someone he had mocked, someone he had dismissed. And though he would not say it aloud, the irony carved deeply into him. Linda set the cleaning bucket down at her feet. She straightened her shoulders, no longer shrinking in the shadow of his wealth. Her voice was firm. "I accept the promotion, and I'll do the job better than anyone else you could hire." Omar looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a servant but a woman who had carried dignity through years of humiliation. His nod was almost imperceptible, but it was the first gesture of respect he had offered her in half a decade. Michael slipped the last recorder into his backpack, zipping it shut with finality. He turned to his mother. "We're done here." But before they could leave, Omar's voice stopped them. "Wait." They turned. The billionaire's expression was conflicted, weighed down with more than pride. His voice was quieter than it had ever been. "You said once that languages make people see each other as human. I haven't been human in a long time. I forgot what it meant." Michael regarded him for a long moment. Then he said, "Remembering is your choice. Changing is your responsibility." The words landed heavy, echoing louder than any threat. Omar lowered his head slightly, and for the first time it looked less like defeat and more like acceptance. Michael and Linda walked to the door. Each step felt like a victory, small, quiet, but undeniable. And though the confrontation in that penthouse seemed over, both mother and son knew the story had not reached its conclusion. Outside those walls, an empire still thrived, an empire built on old habits and old arrogance. The contract was signed, but whether its promises would be kept was a test that would play out in the months ahead. As Michael reached for the door handle, his mother's voice came in a whisper, trembling but proud. "I never thought I'd see this day." Michael looked at her, his voice steady. "It's just the first day, Mom. And with that, they stepped out, leaving Omar Rahman alone in his glittering office, staring at the signed contract and the silent recorder that had changed everything. The empire had not fallen, not yet, but it had been shaken, and the cracks, once revealed, would only spread. 6 months later, the Bronx Public Library buzzed with a different kind of energy. Rows of young people filled the study rooms, their notebooks spread open, their laptops humming. For years the library had been seen as a quiet refuge, but now it pulsed like a command center of ambition. And at the center of it all sat Omar Rahman, not behind marble and glass, but at a simple wooden table. He looked out across the room at the faces of teenagers, many from neighborhoods he had once dismissed. Their voices carried laughter, curiosity, and determination. The scholarship program demanded by Michael Carter had become real, and dozens of students now pursued opportunities Omar himself had once thought impossible for them. Maria, a 15-year-old girl with sharp eyes and a notebook covered in doodles, raised her hand. She spoke with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Mr. Rahman, is it true that Michael got his first job by blackmailing you?" The room rippled with laughter. Omar leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at his lips, different from the cruel one he had worn months before. "It's true," he admitted openly, "and it was the best thing that ever happened to me." At another table, Michael Carter sat with a stack of contracts in front of him, his pen moving quickly as he reviewed translations and rewrote clauses. He was 15 now, officially recognized as the youngest language consultant in corporate history. Since joining Rahman Industries, his corrections had already secured over $200 million in new business. Maria leaned forward eagerly. "Tell us the whole story." Omar's eyes found Linda Carter across the room. She wore a tailored suit now, no longer carrying cleaning buckets but leading teams as facility supervisor. Her quiet smile urged him to continue. Omar folded his hands together, his voice resonant but no longer arrogant. "6 months ago, I was a wealthy man, but miserable. I thought money made me superior. Then Michael showed me how wrong I was. He didn't just prove he could speak 9 languages. He proved that intelligence, determination, and dignity can come from anywhere, even the Bronx, especially the Bronx." Carlos, a boy of 13 scribbling lines of computer code in his notebook, looked up curiously. "But how did Michael know it would work? Weren't you furious?" Michael glanced up from his papers, his voice calm but carrying authority. "I researched him. For months, I knew his history. I knew he had grown up poor, that he came to America as a teenager with almost no English and built his empire from scratch. I knew he had forgotten where he came from." Omar nodded, the admission clear. "I had become the very thing I once despised. As a young man, people discriminated against me because of my accent, my skin, my lack of privilege. But I had buried that memory under pride. Michael forced me to remember." Maria's eyes widened. "So you changed everything because of him?" Linda stepped closer, her voice strong, carrying dignity that had been hidden for years. "Now the company is the most diverse in the industry. We hire based on competence, not last names or addresses." The group of students leaned in, listening intently. Omar rose from his chair and gestured toward a wall where framed certificates lined the plaster. Each one bore the name of a scholarship recipient, the first 50 beneficiaries of the program Michael had demanded. "Do you know what the greatest discovery I've made is?" Omar asked, his voice softer now. The students answered in unison. "What?" "That when you invest in people, regardless of where they come from, they don't just grow. They make you grow too." Michael set his pen down and joined them. His steps were steady, his presence commanding without effort. He stood beside Omar, the boy and the billionaire side by side, a sight no one in that room would forget. Carlos asked him directly, his young voice tinged with admiration. "But weren't you afraid? Afraid of failing?" Michael's reply was honest. "Of course I was afraid. But my mother taught me that the greatest failure is to accept being treated as less than you are worth. I'd rather risk everything than stay invisible." The students nodded, their faces reflecting awe and inspiration. Omar studied Michael, realizing that what impressed him most was not the 9 languages or the brilliance of his proposals. It was the courage to stand against power with nothing but preparation and conviction. Maria pressed further, leaning across the table. "But you had a plan, didn't you? You didn't just walk into his office blind." Michael smiled faintly. "Always have a plan, and always have evidence to back it up." Linda placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes shining. "It's time to go, Michael. We have a meeting with Japanese investors in an hour." Omar turned back to the group of students, his voice warm. "Do you want to know the best part of this story? Michael now earns more at 15 than I did at his age, not because of inheritance, not because of privilege, but because of merit and discipline." The students applauded softly, a ripple of admiration passing through the room. Michael gathered his papers, slipping them into his backpack, now less worn but still the same symbol of preparation. He walked toward the exit with his mother at his side. Omar followed them with his eyes, a weight pressing at his chest. He called out, his tone unusually personal. "Michael." The boy turned. "Yes, sir?" Omar's voice trembled slightly. "You didn't just save my company, you saved me. I was becoming a monster, powerful, rich, but empty inside. You forced me to remember what success really means." Michael looked at him steadily. "Success isn't about being the smartest in the room. It's about recognizing the intelligence in others. You know that now." Omar's nod was slow, deliberate. "Yes, and I'm honored to have learned it from you and your mother." Linda kissed her son's forehead, whispering for him alone. "I'm proud of you. Not for the money, not for the recognition, for the man you're becoming." As they left the library, the hum of youthful voices filled the air behind them, carrying the promise of a generation rising. The world outside still pulsed with inequality, prejudice, and arrogance. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted. And though Omar Rahman knew he could never erase the mistakes of his past, he also knew he would never forget the boy who forced him to face them. Michael Carter walked out of the library that evening, not just as a consultant, not just as a prodigy. He walked out as proof that dignity and preparation could turn the world upside down. And soon, that proof would be tested again, in a boardroom filled with the sharpest negotiators Japan had to offer. The glass-walled conference room overlooked Tokyo Bay, its waters shimmering under the late afternoon sun. Around the polished oak table sat executives and investors, their faces stern, their files stacked neatly in front of them. The air was tight with anticipation. These were seasoned negotiators, men and women accustomed to extracting the best deals for their companies. At one end of the table, Omar Rahman sat in his tailored suit, posture formal but eyes restless. Beside him sat a boy in a crisp blazer, his backpack placed carefully at his feet. Michael Carter's hands rested calmly on the table, his gaze shifting between the Japanese investors and the documents in front of him. An executive cleared his throat and began speaking in Japanese, his tone clipped and precise. The words moved quickly, each phrase layered with subtlety. Omar, though he had hired translators before, could only catch fragments, but Michael nodded, listening intently. When the investor finished, Michael turned smoothly to Omar and translated, his voice carrying every nuance, every layer of courtesy and caution. "They are concerned about the delivery timeline," Michael explained, "but more than that, they want assurance that your company respects long-term trust, not just quick profit. They are asking if you can guarantee continuity for the next decade." Omar blinked. "That's what he said." Michael's voice was steady. "That's what he meant." The investors looked at the boy with raised brows, intrigued. They had not expected a teenager at the negotiation table, much less one who spoke their language with natural rhythm. Michael turned back to them, responding in flawless Japanese, his tone warm but firm. The investors leaned in, nodding as his words flowed. Linda Carter sat a little farther down the table, silently observing. She wore her new suit with ease now, the facility supervisor who had once carried buckets of cleaning supplies. Pride welled in her chest as she watched her son navigate a room that had been built to intimidate. Another executive spoke, his words sharper, laced with skepticism. Michael listened, then turned to Omar. "He is testing your resolve," he said calmly. "He's suggesting that your past contracts show weakness in commitment. He wants to see if you'll fold." Omar's jaw tightened. "What should I say?" Michael's gaze met his. "You don't say it, I will." Switching back to Japanese, Michael's voice rose with conviction. He acknowledged the concerns, outlined the company's restructuring, and referenced the new diversity program as proof of cultural understanding. His words carried not just business precision, but human sincerity. The executives exchanged glances, surprised by the depth of his argument. When he finished, silence lingered. Then slowly the lead investor nodded. A ripple of agreement passed around the table. Pens began to move, signatures falling onto paper. The deal was sealed, $500 million, secured not by wealth or intimidation, but by the voice of a 15-year-old boy from the Bronx. Omar exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. Relief washed over his face, but so did something deeper: respect. He turned to Michael and said softly, "You just accomplished what my entire team couldn't." "You saved this deal." Michael gathered the papers calmly. "Words matter, sir, they always have." After the meeting, reporters flooded the hallway. Flashing cameras lit up as microphones were thrust forward. A journalist from Forbes stepped close, addressing Omar. "Mr. Rahman, how does it feel to be the first billionaire CEO to employ a 15-year-old advisor?" Omar's lips curved into a smile that held no arrogance, only truth. "It feels," he said carefully, "like I finally understand what leadership means. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about recognizing and nurturing the intelligence of others." The cameras turned toward Michael. The journalist asked, "And you, Michael, what's your advice to other young people watching this, to those who come from difficult circumstances like yours?" Michael paused, choosing his words with the same care he gave his translations. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "Never let anyone define your worth based on appearances or circumstances. Where you come from doesn't decide where you'll go. And always, always have evidence to back up your voice." Linda's eyes shimmered as she listened. For years she had scrubbed floors, endured silence, and bent her back for survival. Now, her son's words echoed across a room filled with cameras and microphones. Another reporter called out, "Do you believe this story will inspire others?" Linda stepped forward, her voice steady, carrying all the weight of years spent invisible. "This story proves that when you combine talent with opportunity and courage with preparation, there is no limit to what can happen." Omar nodded beside her, his voice warm. "Michael taught me that true wealth isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you build. The greatest investment you can make is in human potential." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Michael, Linda, and Omar moved toward the waiting elevator. As the doors closed, silence settled around them. Omar turned, looking at Michael with a gravity that few men his age could carry. "You changed my company," he said quietly. "But more than that, you changed me. You reminded me of my own beginnings, of the struggles I tried to forget. You gave me back my humanity." Michael met his gaze calmly. "Then don't waste it. Use it to lift others." Linda placed her hand gently on her son's shoulder, whispering, "I'm proud of you, baby. Not for the deals, not for the money. For standing tall." Omar looked at them both, his voice softer than ever. "Family isn't just blood. It's the people who make you want to be better. You've both become my family too." Later that evening, Michael sat at his desk in the hotel room, reviewing contracts in 3 different languages. Outside, Tokyo sparkled with neon lights, a city alive with ambition. He paused, staring out at the skyline, his reflection staring back in the glass. For the first time, he allowed himself a smile, not of triumph, but of quiet determination. He knew the battles weren't over. The world was still filled with prejudice, arrogance, and those who underestimated boys like him. But he also knew he carried the one weapon no one could take away: knowledge, sharpened with preparation. Omar's words echoed in his mind. True wealth is what you build. And Michael Carter intended to build more than contracts. He intended to build a world where no child would ever have to prove their worth by blackmailing a billionaire just to be seen. The boy from the Bronx, the son of a cleaning lady, had turned humiliation into redemption and power into justice. His voice had changed one man's destiny. Tomorrow it might change the world. Winter winds swept through the Bronx, rattling the windows of the library that had become the unlikely headquarters of change. Inside, warmth radiated not from the heaters, but from the collective hum of voices. Students reading, debating, dreaming. Certificates lined one wall, each bearing the name of a young person whose life had shifted because one boy refused to bow. At the center of the room, Michael Carter sat at a long wooden table, his backpack beside him as always. Papers were spread before him, contracts in Russian, Spanish, and Arabic, while a laptop glowed with correspondence from Europe and Asia. He was no longer just the prodigy who spoke 9 languages. He was a force recognized in boardrooms across the globe. Linda Carter walked past, clipboard in hand, checking on the scholarship students. She wore her supervisor's badge with quiet pride, her suit neat and commanding. But her smile as she looked at her son was the true emblem of her transformation. Omar Rahman entered quietly, not in the tailored arrogance of months past, but in a simple coat. He looked around the library, watching the teenagers scribble notes, tap keyboards, and whisper translations to each other. His voice was low, almost reverent. "This place feels more powerful than any skyscraper I've ever built." Michael didn't look up from his papers. "That's because it builds people, not walls." Omar chuckled softly, the sound lacking mockery, filled instead with humility. "You're sharper than most leaders twice your age. Do you ever rest?" Michael finally raised his head, his voice calm. "Rest is for when the work is done, and it isn't done yet." Maria, the 15-year-old student who had once pressed Omar for the full story, appeared at Michael's side with her notebook. "Mr. Carter," she said eagerly, "I finished the translation exercise you gave me. Can you check it?" Michael read her lines carefully, nodding as he corrected a single phrase. "Good work. But remember, it's not just about words. It's about meaning. Language is more than grammar. It's connection." Maria's eyes shone. "Like how you connected with those Japanese investors." Michael allowed a faint smile. "Exactly like that." Omar watched the exchange with quiet awe. Months ago, he had laughed at this boy. Now, he studied him with something close to reverence. He turned to Linda, speaking softly. "He's not just gifted. He's inevitable. The world can't ignore him." Linda's voice carried pride and firmness. "The world ignored us long enough. It won't ignore him." The group gathered at the front of the library for a small ceremony. 50 students, the first wave of the scholarship program, stood proudly as their names were called. Each received a certificate from Omar's hand, but every eye in the room drifted toward Michael. Carlos, the young programmer, raised his hand. "Michael, what's next for you? You already saved billion-dollar deals. You already forced change in one of the biggest companies in America. What comes after that?" Michael looked around the room, at faces eager and hopeful, at his mother's proud smile, at Omar's humbled gaze. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with quiet fire. "What comes next is making sure none of you have to fight the way I did just to be seen. No one should have to blackmail their way into fairness. Opportunity shouldn't depend on luck. It should depend on preparation and courage." The students nodded, some whispering to each other, inspired. Omar stepped forward, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Michael taught me that wealth without justice is poverty in disguise. I intend to build more than profit. I intend to build people, and I want all of you to hold me accountable." Michael placed a hand on the table, leaning slightly forward. "Remember this," he said, his tone cutting through the room. "Evidence matters. Preparation matters. Dignity matters. That's how you win battles without raising your voice, without throwing a punch. That's how you turn the impossible into the inevitable. Linda's eyes glistened. She whispered for herself, though her words carried in the silence, "That's my son." The library filled with applause, not thunderous, but steady, heartfelt. In those claps echoed the sound of a world shifting, one step at a time. Later, as the students dispersed and night fell over the Bronx, Omar lingered by the window. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "I built skyscrapers, but they'll crumble one day. What we've started here, this will last longer." Michael stood beside him, his voice calm but certain. "That's because skyscrapers are made of stone. People are made of words, and words last forever." Omar turned to him, a faint smile breaking the solemnity. "You frighten me sometimes, Michael, not because of what you know, but because of what you make me remember." Michael met his gaze steadily. "Then don't forget again." Linda joined them, her presence grounding the moment. She looked at Omar, then at her son. "He won't," she said firmly, "because now he knows what it costs." The three of them stood together in the quiet library, surrounded by books that had changed one boy's life and were now changing many more. Outside, the Bronx pulsed with its usual chaos, sirens, voices, restless energy. But inside, the hum of possibility was louder. Michael Carter gathered his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He looked out at the city lights, his voice carrying into the night. "This is just the beginning." And as the word settled, it was clear. The boy who once stood humiliated in a penthouse had become the young man who would shape destinies, not through power taken, but through truth spoken. The legacy of words had begun. This story reminds us that true power isn't money or status. It's knowledge, courage, and the willingness to stand tall, no matter where you come from. If this inspired you, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment sharing what you learned. Your voice matters here.